Welcome to Solutions with Courtney Anderson. I am Courtney Anderson, and I'm delighted that you've joined me today. As always, I do encourage you to go to CourtneyAnderson.com and join into our community any way that you would like and however you feel comfortable. So today we have a show that is one of the Management Magicians series. And of course, our Management Magicians series is dedicated to, inspired by those of us who volunteer to serve as managers. And of course, it seems like it's magic, right? It seems like it's magic when you see somebody who is really a powerful manager and you see how easy it looks like their job is, right? It's because they have implemented powerful and effective tools for themselves and for their team, and it looks like magic, but it isn't. It's just really well-constructed decision-making process that is consistent with clear communication and a lot of confidence in yourself as a manager and in other people and in the larger society and belief in the system, as they refer to it. So when we look at this idea here of looking at our managers and specifically celebrating, admiring, paying homage to the management magicians, our specific show today is how much of a leader does a manager need to be? And so when we ask this question, how much of a leader does a manager need to be? It's one of those issues and one of those shows that initially we would put together the show schedule. I looked and I thought, this is a seemingly simple question, right? But as you really delve into it, it becomes rather sophisticated. It really does. And so one of the things that I often do when we're looking at these types of questions that either are deceptively seemingly simple, or actually maybe they are simple, we have to explore. The first place we often start is looking at definitions, right? And so this is no exception to that practice, right? Because the issue is I could get caught up on, what do you mean by leader, right? And this has, of course, happened. I've had the pleasure and privilege for almost the last 15 years going around the world and so many wonderful places working with groups, organizations, keynote speaking, corporate education, and training programs. And so I've had a lot of instances of fantastic high levels of engagement, collaborative problem solving, but I've also had people who, especially when it's a mandatory, it's presented that we're going to have an event together, but it's going to be mandatory, and someone might not be excited to come to our corporate education program. I get a lot of engagement, but with people who have very specific agendas. And so people will ask, what do you mean by that? What does it mean? Okay. So that's one of the reasons that we look at definitions. Looking at definitions, and I put some in the show notes, I went to my old handy-dandy dictionary, and I looked up leader. And it's got a whole bunch of different things about leaders. Leaders could be, part of a plant. A leader could be in British English, a newspaper editorial. What I was really looking for is a person who's in a leadership position. That's why we're talking about management. And so I took that part of the definition, and it says a person who leads, makes sense, right, is a leader. It says a person who directs a military force or unit. Okay, could be. We could be talking about management there. Or we could be talking about a person who has commanding authority or influence. So that's what you'll see in the show notes, is that part of leader, commanding authority or influence. Okay, so it could be someone in the military. All right, got that. And I certainly have had the pleasure of working with, especially in the United States. I've worked on naval air stations. I've worked with the United States Marine Corps. I've worked with the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I've worked with the United States Air Force. It's been really wonderful to have that kind of exposure in that setting with people who are in military organizations. That's just one nation, but a couple of different branches of that military. So that's one situation, leader. Now we're looking at the situation here. What's this thing about manage? What's something about a manager? All right, well, again, we get this thing about someone who manages. That makes sense, right? Part of the definition. And then we have, and I have one in the show notes, a person who conducts business or household affairs, a person whose work or profession is management, and then a person who directs a team or an athlete, or student who is in scholastic or collegiate sports, supervises equipment, and records under the direction of a coach. So we're not focusing on that one with the team or athlete or the coach specifically. Again, very narrow. And I've had the opportunity to work with some sporting entities where we've got a lot of athletes. So again, military, I love it, very important, but that's too narrow for what we're focusing on in our show. And then sporting events, athletics, very important, but not what we're focusing on for our broad management magician focus. So what we're doing is asking ourselves, hey, what's this thing called leader? What's this thing called manager? And does this thing that's a leader, does the thing that's a manager need to have this other thing that's called leader part of it? Or are they totally separate? So the question, how much of a leader does a manager need to be? Well, the answer could be zero. The answer could be nothing. The answer could be you don't need, how much do you need? Zero. That could be an answer. You don't need any of it. One thing is a manager, one thing is a leader. They're totally separate. You don't need to have any of this leader stuff sprinkled, added to part of your manager. It could be something totally discrete and separate. That's part of what we're trying to figure out in the show. The other questions that we're exploring are, okay, well, if instead it's not zero, we could have the other end of the extreme. It could be 100%. Right? That leader is synonymous with manager. It means the exact same thing. That when I use these two words, it was just me being creative and colorful because they literally mean the exact same thing. Leader, manager, interchangeable, same thing. I can be a leader. You can call me leader. You can call me manager. It means the exact same thing. Could be. So we have zero as an option. We have 100% as an option. And then, of course, we have potentially an option of somewhere in the middle. Somewhere between 0, right, and 100%. Let's walk through it. First, let's ask ourselves, is it 100%? Is it that leader and manager mean exactly the same thing? Because that would help us move through the show much faster and would potentially, make us a little bit more confident. Hey, I have the answer to the question because it's the same thing. So let's look and see. I'm back at my dictionary information I have on the show notes. Of course, I'm sticking on my sort of selected definition content that relates to the broad issue of management, potentially, and or leadership. Again, leader, we're going with that part of the definition that says a person who has commanding authority or influence. Interesting. Manager says a person who conducts business or household affairs, which I love because so much of what I mention in so many of our programs is I try to always take us beyond this idea, I'm only managing at work. And I do a lot of analogies between managing outside of work and managing inside a work environment, whether it's a formal environment, informal, whether you're paid or you're a volunteer. None of that is, to me, really specifically relevant to these broad questions. Now, and once we start moving to more specific applied issues, of course we're going to have to make different calibrations based on some of those criteria. So leader on one hand says person who has commanding authority or influence. Love that. Commanding authority or influence. Manager, person who conducts business or household affairs, or a person whose work or profession is management. All right, so let's ask, are those the same thing? Does it mean exactly the same thing? Does it mean commanding authority or influence and conduct business or household affairs? Let's see. Can we think of any examples where we have a person who conducts business or household affairs, right? Conducts them, but they don't have commanding authority or influence. Can we think of that? Can we think of it? Yes, we can. The easiest example is thinking of it with household affairs. How many times have you ever had a friend or colleague, family member, or distant family member, I'm sure, who you visited where they live, their household, and even though they should have been the one that was making decisions and making things happen, right? Let's say that the other people in the household are 4 years old, and 14 years old. And then you have your friend, relative, distant relative that you're visiting, and they're 34. So you have a 34-year-old, an adult, and you have a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old, and you go to visit their household. Now, we would think initially that 4-year-olds and 14-year-olds, just due to the fact that they are not adults, they are children, a 4-year-old especially, a very young child, a 14-year-old developing child, adolescent child, we would think the 34-year-old should be the one, right? Have you ever gone to somebody's house? Now, the 34-year-old is the only one who can really conduct that household affair, right? Because the 4-year-old and the 14-year-old, I'm using most parts of the world, they're not able to go out and sign legal contracts, they're not going to work full-time jobs, they're not going to be able to buy a house and get a mortgage, they're not going to, in most parts of the world, they're not able to drive unrestricted, okay? The 4-year-old especially, so you would think 34-year-old who has the capacity, right, to sign contracts, to enter into a lease, to drive, right, to have a checkbook or a bank account, like there's a lot that happens. You would think that person who's conducting the business, because the 4-year-old and the 14-year-old aren't the ones who are like writing out checks, or hopefully, let me put aside the asides for humor. They don't legally have the ability to do it. They can't walk into a bank and say, hey, I'm ready to open an account, I need to put my paycheck in there, direct deposit, and then I need to go ahead and set up my bills for bill pay and get things done. So the 34-year-old is the one that has to do it because there's nobody else that's able to do it legally, culturally. So you go to their house. Have you ever seen it where there's someone, in my example, imaginary 34-year-old, and you're thinking, okay, well, they should be, right? They are the manager because they're the only one that can manage. They're the only one that can conduct that household affair, task, agenda. They're the only one that can do it, okay? Have you ever seen it where somebody they're conducting that household affairs, and they do not have a commanding authority or influence? Have you ever seen it? Okay. I know I have, and I can't count how many times. I've seen it with people who I've met in all types of life. Maybe I'm at a store. I'm going out to buy something in my free time. I'm going to go to a store, maybe a shopping center or shopping mall, and I see young people who look very young, 4, 5, 8 years old, and I see somebody who looks older than that, appears to be an adult, and yet the adult does not seem like they have the commanding authority or influence. It seems like the authority and the person who's deciding what we're going to do is one of the minors. I've seen this, and I know you have too. It is painful to think about and remember, right? When you have the adult who's conducting the affairs because they have to. They're the only one that can drive and have a credit card in their own name legally, and you see minor children that run the show. What do I mean by run the show? They have commanding authority or influence. I have seen this, and I've seen this recently. Especially when you're out in society, like I said, you're out at a shopping center, you're out at the grocery store, you're out at the market, and you'll see it. There's a small person who very obviously is not an adult, and they are in control because they have a commanding authority or influence. No! Give me that! Daddy, no! Give me now! I want to go! Is any of this, and again, we're moving forward very quickly because even the memory of this is stressful. It's stressful for many of us who love leadership, who love business, who love management, who just love life. When you see that the person that has commanding authority or influence, it's not the person who's actually conducting business or household affairs. It's not at all. I've seen this, and I'm giving easy examples with the minor children, but I've certainly seen it in all the other permutations this exists, right? Where we get all kinds of situations where somebody should be, right, and actually is managing. They're the one that is conducting business or household affairs, but they're not the one that has commanding authority or influence. There's other people, sometimes children, and they're the ones that command authority. I don't want to go there. I want to eat somewhere else. I don't like this. All right. Now, saying that is one thing, but the fact that they'll say it and then that the person who's the manager actually goes along and follows that. Okay. And they make decisions based on what a 4-year-old wants. They make decisions based on what a 14-year-old wants or anybody else. Okay. I just want you to be happy. I'm telling you that, I'm just going to do this one time. Don't talk to me that way, please. I see this. And I have not just seen this in the United States. Now, there are different cultural expectations in different parts of the world, but I have seen this type of behavior all over the world. I've seen it in Africa. I've seen it in Asia. I've seen it in Australia. I've seen it in North America. I've seen it in Europe. I have seen it. Now we're going to move on, but I'm just for a minute. I know I've seen it. I know you have too. And it's frustrating. Because when you've got somebody who has commanding authority or influence, and they're not the one actually that's in charge of conducting the business, it becomes this power struggle. And that's exactly what we just described. So just keep imagining that 34-year-old who's all the decisions are made by the 4-year-old. It's frustrating because the power struggle sets up a lot of challenges for everybody else, because then when you interact with the person who's the manager, who's conducting the household affairs, the reality is they're not the ones that are making the actual final decisions. What time are we going to go out to eat? Well, I wanted to go about 5, but, little Johnny doesn't, he needs me right now, so can we make it about 7? It's difficult because you're trying to make decisions with the person who's conducting the household affairs, the 34-year-old, but you're learning in real life that that's not who has commanding authority or influence. And it's much more difficult then to figure out who do I go to get stuff done, how quickly can I get it done, who's the one that's going to be finally the one that's making the decision. And so that's just from the outside. We're not even going to touch in this show what it's like to be on the inside of that, right? To be the 34-year-old, the one who's conducting the affairs, who's ruled by, right? Somebody else, whether it's a 4-year-old or 14-year-old or whoever. But it happens all the time. So that's all to ask the question, were these one and the same? Are they synonymous? Were they 100%? Nope. Because you can have them and they're not all the time the same thing. And we just gave a very drawn-out discussion of that. So that brings me to my next option. It's not 100% because we just did that and that didn't work. So is it 0%? Do you never have somebody who is a commanding authority or influence and at the same time also is able to conduct the business or conduct the household affairs? You know what? Think about it. Well, I've seen it. Again, all these anecdotes are just here to sort of help support some of my personal assertion, but beyond this, there's a lot of data. So certainly, I encourage you, as always, we talk a lot about this, right? Go find credible sources, go do your own research, and take the time to figure out what you think, but the research does support that there are examples where you have someone who is the one conducting the business or household affairs, all right? So let's take our 34-year-old example I gave in the first part. And the 34-year-old, the 14-year-old, and the 4-year-old. In this other example, though, option 2, you have 34-year-old, and you're the one that's coming over to visit, right, because they're a very distant relative or an old childhood friend. And you're the one talking to the 34-year-old who is the one conducting, the business, the household, because they're the only one that can drive and has any money that they've earned and has control of. And you say to them, okay, so, we're going to go to dinner around 5 o'clock, and you get there, and sure enough, here's the 34-year-old, hey, it's so great you're here. It's about 5 minutes till 5. Well, I'm ready to go. Let me just get my shoes. Everything's ready to be locked up. I'm excited to go to dinner. It's going to be wonderful. And you say, well, is everything okay? The kids? And, oh, yeah, the kids are great. The kids are great. One of them is at an after-school program, and the other one is with one of my relatives, just spending some time with family. So let's head out. We're ready to go. I've seen it in real life when I'm out at the shopping center or the groceries, and there's somebody that looks to be the adult that should be the one conducting the household affairs, and there look to be some younger people. And what do I see? I see the most wonderful thing. I see that the younger person, I want this now! Give it to me now! And then the person who is the adult, takes control of the situation and says something to the effect of, this is not the place and this is not the time. We're going to leave the store right now. All right? And we're going to talk about this when we get home, but you understand that that was not acceptable. All right, let's go. So having commanding authority or influence doesn't mean that you're boisterous and loud. It doesn't mean that you're mean. All it means is you're the one who we all look to in this situation that's going to make the decision. Are we staying here at the store or are we leaving? You have that influence. You're in command. I've seen it. I've seen it where the person who is managing, right, who's conducting the household affairs, is also the same one that's got the commanding influence. They're the one that's making the decision. Now that means then it can't be 0%, because I've witnessed it, and again, the research supports this, and I'm sure in your own life, when you think about it, you're like, yeah, I see that, and in fact, I see that a lot. That's kind of ideally how maybe it should work. Now that's a judgment, right? Ideally how it should work, where the person who is the one that's conducting business or household affairs also is the one that has some commanding authority or influence. So we know it's not 100%. We know it's not 0%. It's got to be somewhere in the middle. Now, how much of it in the middle is perfect? Can I sit here and potentially have a show? It's not going to be today, but have a show in the future that makes it, really, definitive that, hey, it needs to be, 52.3% needs to be of a manager needs to be leader. It's possible that I could go out and conduct some research, and not some, but some appropriate research, the appropriate sample size, and be able to answer the question at some point in the future. I have not at this juncture done so I can't tell you the exact percentage, but it's going to be somewhere in there between 0 and 100. Now, my professional opinion would be that you want to make sure that the management, which is conducting things, right, conducting the business, conducting the household affairs, is on parity, or has parity with, equality with the leadership part of it. That's the person who's commanding authority or influence. Because here's the thing, and then now in the example we had where the person who conducts things, right? I'm conducting. I'm the one. I'm organizing. I'm conducting. If that person doesn't have the commanding authority or influence at a high percentage, and there's somebody else in that household or in that business who does, then they're going to challenge. You're going to have that same power struggle that we talked about early on, right? With the 4-year-old and the 34-year-old arguing over what's going to happen, And it's the same thing in a business. Somebody needs to make the decision. If it's not going to be the manager because they don't have a high enough percentage of leadership that is part of what they're communicating to their organization, then there's going to always potentially be somebody else out there, and I don't care what their job title is. Just like it could be a 4-year-old who dominates a 34-year-old. It happens. There can be somebody who, is a part-time not even, so they're not full-time, they're not anywhere near management, they're an intern, I don't know. Meaning that they don't have a lot of experience, and they've been there long, they don't have a lot of expertise, and they still can come into an organization and have commanding authority or influence. How? By just taking it. People say, how does that happen? Well, we don't want to dwell too long. This is a painful example. We talked about this, where the 4-year-old does take it. They just take control. If a young person, less than 5 years old, can take control of an adult, and this is what we're going to eat, this is how long I'm going to stay in the store, and this is what I'm going to sit, where I'm going to sit on the plane, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to say. If they can do that, which they can and they do, then it's certainly much easier for another adult, I don't care what size or age or anything, to go in there and dominate another adult, because you don't even have this huge difference where one person is so, at a disadvantage by their age, when they're not able to, drive or do much. But if you can have, again, somebody under 5 years old do this, you certainly can have somebody at your office do this. So I don't care how old they are, because it's not related to that. It's related to who's going to take commanding authority or influence in this household or in this business. And then the answer is whoever wants it. So if the 4-year-old wants it and nobody else is going to do anything to prohibit them from achieving that and surpassing that goal, they're going to have it. If the 34-year-old wants it and nobody else is going to do anything to stop them, they're going to have it. Now, of course, the question would be, what if the 4-year-old and the 34-year-old both want it? Well, this is where leadership comes in, this whole thing. Somebody's going to take command. Now, it's harder when you have when you have one person who's not an adult, because they don't have the experience, they don't have the skills, they don't have the same options, right? If you have two adults, then you have a totally different dynamic. But you also have both parties with more similar options. So if you're at a business, and I have seen this, oh gosh, you're at a business and I've really seen this, which is, okay, I've seen someone who's a support team member, like an administrative team member. The word used to be like secretarial staff. That's not really appropriate, I don't think, for a lot of what people do, because there's a lot to this, or an administrative assistant. I've seen people in that position where they're supposed to be the assistant to, right, or the front desk member for someone who's supposed to, at least on paper, have more power. Right, so I'm the administrative assistant to the vice president of whatever. I'm the front desk person for the director of whatever. And that person will actually be the one who has commanding authority or influence. They will really be the one who tells the other person what to do. I've even seen this. I've seen judges, and I've shared in other programs that I'm a lawyer, not your lawyer, and by virtue of us sharing the time together, but I'm an attorney, and I used to take a lot of work where I would be hired by other law firms who were out of state or out of my city. And then they would hire my law firm to just go on sort of smaller cases that they didn't want to spend the money and the resources to send their own in-house lawyer. It was maybe a very routine type of case. And so I would do a lot of that. It's called being local counsel. And so when I took that work, and I took it for years, I still take it every once in a while now when my schedule permits. And it's great because it allows me to keep my face and presence in the courtroom. Unfortunately, with my schedule, with so many different things, this show and all the other things I do in my teaching and my real life, something has to give. There's only so many hours in a day. But anyway, when I would go do local counsel work, I get to go to all these different types of courthouses all over. Sometimes I would just think, well, I'd like to go to that place, and then I'd go contact some of my clients and pick up work in that part of the area, of the region, because I'd never been there. So there are places I might have been only once in my whole life and were nowhere near my home base, which was in the Central Texas region. But I went to South Texas and West Texas and East Texas and North Texas. It was exciting. It's a big state. And I've seen with my own eyes where there are judges whose job is what you would think, to judge. That's the judge. That's the judge of whatever this court is. And yet, they're not the ones that are having the actual final decision. They don't have commanding authority or influence. I've seen it where their administrative staff has commanding authority or influence. I've seen it where their clerks or other support team members in court have it. I've literally seen judges who sit and wait for a support team member that works for them, like full-time in their job, right, to tell them what to do. They will literally. There have been my experiences where it's happened, and it's unnerving and it's odd, but it's no odder than watching a 4-year-old tell a 34-year-old what to do. But I've seen it, and it's sometimes it's a little casual. Oh, okay, I'm considering, and then I've seen where that support member lets their opinion be known. Rarely will do it publicly where it's recorded, but they certainly will do it right. Everyone's standing right there in the little. Some of these courts are really small, right? They're like little. It's not like a big fancy courtroom. A lot of these places are small counties, small towns. That's why the law firm's not sitting people. It's a small case. There's a small little case for a small amount of money in a small court. I'm going for some of the reasons I share with you, and it's interesting and it keeps my law skills in use. But sometimes it's small little areas, and you can hear everything, and even though you would think, well, the judge has to be the one that has commanding authority or influence, not necessarily. I've seen it. So these are extreme examples, but what's the point? The point is simply this. The question is, hey, I am a management magician, or I aspire to be a management magician, or I just really admire and support all management magicians. And how much of a leader does a manager need to be? The answer is as much as necessary to take control. Of what? Take control of what? Of the business or the household. That's what they need. If the person who is the manager does not do that, then they are not the leader. Someone else will fill the power void. So that's why you have families. And I said there were a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old. The 14-year-old could have been the one to take the power. It could have been that the 14-year-old used to have power, and then the 4-year-old came along, now they took power. It could be that they share power. But if you just leave it where the person who's been conducting things, like getting stuff done, if they don't take the power of the leadership, the commanding authority or influence, then it's not like no one will take power, like it'll just sit there with the empty power vacuum. Sometimes it'll happen for temporary time periods until someone either realizes or someone new comes into the situation and looks and figures out, oh, nobody else has power, I'll just take it. I will take commanding authority or influence. And if it's a household, I'll decide what time we leave, what we're going to eat, if we're going to have donuts, what time I go to bed. That's a huge thing, right? Bedtime. I'll decide. And if it's at work or a business, then that entity, or which could be a business or a governmental agency that conducts some sort of business for the society, like a court, then it's going to be the same thing. I'll decide. What do we do? When do we leave for the day? Who do we hire? Who gets disciplined? This happens. So it's, in a very simplified big picture assessment, it's simple. Managers are usually volunteers at some level. So it could be, I said in my early example, the 4-year-old, 34-year-old. 34-year-old wasn't kidnapped and put in that household. That would have been a different scenario. They voluntarily chose to be in that household, right? So once you volunteer, then you're going to have to conduct the business. That's okay. The challenge is some people who get into management who are obviously not management magicians. They're managers, and they do understand that they're supposed to conduct business, right? Like the 34-year-old, well, okay, I'm supposed to be the one that takes care of the utilities and makes sure that everything's, organized and pays bills. They do get that part, meaning they understand that, and they usually will do it, because if they don't do it, nobody else can do it. So it won't be done, and they won't have any electricity. The challenge, though, comes in these other power struggles in terms of who's going to really be in command with the authority and the influence to make bigger decisions. The decisions of what to do is what the leader does. The how to do it is what the manager does. But the thing is, the manager is following what the leader has already determined, right? So the leader is, what are we going to do? Okay, we're going to have this video game system. That's what the leader decides. That's why, like I said, I've seen a lot with little minor children, little by small, right, and little in terms of age. They'll decide, we're going to have this video game. We're going to have this. Okay. Then the manager, the one who's got to conduct it, is the one that's got to go, find it online, get their credit card, pay for it, making sure it gets shipped there. They do the how. But ideally, if you don't have a manager who's also a leader, then you're going to have somebody else step up. It could be anybody of any age, of any job description. It is irrelevant. They'll step up and start deciding the what. And then the poor manager is going to be stuck somewhere. Just all they do is the how. Okay, let me pay for the video game system. Let me make sure that, our office has a sign on the front of it or whatever. They're just following out the how. But the big picture of the what is what the leader does. And again, it's up to you. Honestly, For people who are not management magicians, our management magicians all have made the choice to be managers and the choice to be management magicians, which is, of course, high level and very effective. And, of course, the management magicians, by definition, then all have made the decision to be leaders at a percentage high enough that they're the ones who are making the decisions. They have the authority and the influence. They took it. People who are managers in name only, their title is manager, but they don't manage. They manage in that they'll do the how, but it's difficult for them because they need somebody else to tell them what to do. So they're not effective because unless they get partnered up with some fantastic other person who's leading, that might be their assistant or who knows, and they can keep that forever, or they can keep going to that same person that's making great decisions. Even in that setup, though, it's frustrating for people from the outside. Like I said earlier, when you go to visit the 34-year-old and she's telling you she's got to wait for a 4-year-old to tell you what to do, some people get really stressed out by that, and they get angry. Well, I don't understand. I'm talking to you. You're the adult. How on earth am I having to sit here and wait for this 4-year-old? And it's also the same thing I mentioned in real life when I was in court, and I'm up here I talked to the judge, but that was a total waste of my time, apparently, because the real person I needed to influence or have listened to me is this other support team member who unfortunately doesn't even necessarily know the law or the details of the context of what I'm trying to explain. So it puts everybody else who's having to watch that power struggle, it puts them at a disadvantage, and it usually frustrates and angers them. So they're not really sustainable long term, and there's a ton of conflict involved in them because the manager will say things. Usually they'll say things like, I'm the manager, I'm the parent. But everyone sort of laughs at it because everyone knows, yeah, you do the how, right? Like you pay for things. You drive us places if you're our household, or if you're at work, you're the one that signs off on the forms, but you don't do anything. This other entity or person is the one that really has command and authority and influence, and that's who everybody's going to start going to. And it's very disruptive. It's difficult for people who are new to that situation to figure out what's going on. It creates anger and stress for them, and then it creates resentment. The person who's the manager but not the leader is always resentful of the person who steps up and takes leadership power. But it works the other way too. The person who took the leadership power is resentful and thinks, why would this 34-year-old let me do this? At some level, they really do. They don't respect them at all because they know they control them. And it's so unhealthy. You can see all the destruction and all the negative outcomes that are built into these systems. So, like I said at the outset, it might seem like this isn't a big question or anything, but it really is fundamental. I implore you, if you are just potentially considering being a manager of a household or business, that you understand the consequence if you don't also take the leadership position, that it's going to set up all those really negative outcomes we talked about. So I really encourage you, I implore you, I'm begging you, if you're going to manage, then step up and lead also, so that nobody else is, and that there's unity for other people to be able to come into that household environment or interact with them and know who's making decisions. It's so much more effective, and we won't even begin to talk about the ramifications on the rest of the team, right? What does the 14-year-old think of the 34-year-old who lets a 4-year-old, tell him what to do? It's destructive. You have no ability and no authority then to get anything done with anybody because no one respects your power because you don't really have any. You're just somebody who does stuff. Like, you take care of the how details, but you don't tell anybody what to do. And it becomes, of course, then very high stress and fraught with disrespect and disappointment. So let's not do that. We visited it briefly, and again, this is, we had to talk about these things as part of the analysis, but it's not going to happen. It never happens, of course, with our management magicians, and it's not going to happen with you or anyone else that took part in this program because we thought long and hard about it. Now, if we don't want to be leaders, that's fine, and very few people want to. That also just means then we don't need to step up for the management position. There needs to be somebody else in that household, ideally who's another adult, who's going to then be the manager and the leader. Same thing at work. It's always better to turn something down and say, you know what, I really don't want that promotion. I really don't want to be a supervisor or a lead. It's just not what I do well. I'm a subject matter expert, or I'm excellent with my clients, but that's not what I do well. And then that way you're able to do your job, and you're not doing the conducting part of the business, the manager, the how, right? But you're also not even anywhere near the leading. You're not managing or leading. That's fine. You're doing your other work. Like I said, you're a subject matter expert. You're a writer. You're an engineer. You're a salesperson. I don't care, but you're doing that. You do it well, and you feel good, and you got a good return on your emotions of how you enjoy what you're doing, and it's a win-win. But do not mix this. Don't step into a management position knowing you don't want to lead. Because you do that, and we talked about this, the power vacuum will not sustain. Somebody else will step into it. It's going to create all those horrible bad things we just talked about with really bad outcomes for you, for everybody on the team, for anybody that interacts with the team. I mean, it's just way too many really negative outcomes. So either decline a management position knowing you don't want to do leadership, and that way all of it's off your plate, or accept the management position only if you know that you want to do the leadership position and that you will take that position clearly and assertively and make it clear to everybody else so no one else can try to step into that position or challenge you for power. You have to make it really clear. I'm the leader. I'm in charge. And then everything flows very simply, and we have a system set up for potential awesome success, low stress, healthy emotional and psychological outcomes, and it's just very nurturing and a safe environment. So thank you again for being here and being part of this program. I hope to see you and hear from you at CourtneyAnderson.com, and have a great rest of whatever part of your day is left. Thank you.